Hey friends, Alisa Childers here. Very excited to bring you a discussion today that deals very specifically with the theology of some progressive Christian leaders such as Brian McLaren and Tony Jones. We're going to talk about it with a special guest on today's podcast. My guest today is Dr. R. Scott Smith, a professor at Biola University in the Christian Apologetics program. His master's is in philosophy of religion and ethics from Talbot School of Theology at Biola. His PhD is in religion and social ethics, and that's from USC. He's written several books, and most recently, he's written a book that has really helped me in my research, and it's called Authentically Emergent, in Search of a Truly Progressive Christianity, which is a bit of a provocative title there. It's a very thorough and gracious, yet critical look at the theology of progressive Christian leaders like Brian McLaren, Tony Jones, and Doug Pagitt. Scott, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. This is particularly exciting for me because there just isn't a lot out there that is addressing this topic. I'm seeing more and more as time goes on, but I'm just really thankful for your contribution to this conversation. What was it that first interested you in the theology of the emergent church? How did that come together for you?
Well, my first book on the topic was called Truth in the New Kind of Christian, and it came out in late 2005. And it started because I was trying to come up with a book on addressing postmodernism's influences in the church. And so I was shopping the manuscript one time at the Evangelical Theological Society's national meeting, and I was talking with a publisher there, representative, and he said, let's talk about this. And when he called me, he asked me, do you know who's the number one seller of all these writers, who are writing as Christian postmoderns? I go, let me guess. Maybe Stanley Hauerwas, Stan Grens. I didn't know. He said it's Brian McLaren, and I was kind of like, who's he? And that started me. I started digging into that because of his recommendation, and that got me reading some of Brian's early books and his fictional trilogy. And then Tony Jones and some of his stuff, and I saw connections with the postmodern kind of mindsets, and that's what initiated it. And then when I was teaching my first class on the emerging church here at Biola as part of this program, I was using my book. This was summer 2006, and I had an interview with Tony. In there a lot. He was up in Minnesota. It was just audio. And I think the Lord really impressed on me a particular question to ask him. And it was not on my mind at all beforehand. You could see it in that first book. It just wasn't on my radar screen. But it was something like, ask him what he sees as the connection between my son's suffering on the cross and the body, the body of Christ. And I was like, that just was not, something I'd really thought about. But I asked him. And it was fascinating, to hear his answers. And I had some people in the audience. One of them was one of our grads who was at Fuller at the time. And he was able to say, hey, I can tell you where this stuff's going because of classes I'm in. And he started making these connections in different ways that just really opened my eyes in ways I had no idea. And actually, that's when the ideas for this book started. Because I didn't see so many of these different connections, like their views about what kind of thing we are, human beings, and the implications then for the atonement and sin and all sorts of things, and that just led to a snowball kind of effect.
And one thing I really appreciate about your book is that you didn't just read these guys' books. You didn't just research on your own. You actually interacted with them via email and even in person and really sought to understand their arguments. You're not just building a straw man to knock it down. And I think that brings a great value to your book. So I'm interested, when you had that interaction, it seems like what he was asking was really an atonement question. So what were some of the thoughts he gave when you asked him about that?
Well, as I recall, well, first of all, he started very interestingly. He said that he thought it was very interesting that I asked the question, because it turns out that at his church, which is Solomon's Porch, with Doug Padgett, they were discussing this very topic. So I thought, well, that was interesting, first of all. And then I just let him go and let him just talk. I just wanted to listen and let my students listen. And I remember, the main thing I remember is at one point he made a comment, something like this, that Jesus' example on the cross was the greatest example of humility, ever, or for any of us. And the thought that went through my mind, but I didn't say it, was, well, is that all it is, perhaps, in your thinking? And I didn't know, but I wondered that. And then afterwards, talking with some of the audience, is like, okay, there was more, beneath the surface than I realized. But that's the main thing I remember him saying.
So many Christians are aware of the term emergent church. That seems, in my experience, they tend to know what that is. And then kind of a more modern phrase is progressive Christianity, which really it seems like is just basically what the emergent movement has evolved into now. Can you walk us through the history of emergent thought? How did the whole thing get started to get us where we are today?
I was trying to think back to one of their books that actually explains some of that. And I think Tony Jones, I didn't have a chance to verify that, but I think in the beginning of Tony Jones's book called The New Christians, I think he explains a lot of that. And roughly, and this kind of, by memory here, it started as a conversation among several concerned pastors and youth workers who were noticing changes in the 1990s, in mindsets of the youth they were working with, and the kinds of questions and attitudes, techniques, maybe even that they had been taught or grew up with as leaders were not the kinds of things that were working or connecting, with the youth they were working with. And so they were trying to figure out what's going on here, and they started digging a whole lot into it. Brian McLaren became part of this think tank, I guess you could call it. I think it was originally called the Terra Nova Project. That's my loose memory. Leadership Network, I think, helped sponsor that, to get people together and discuss things. I think Padgett was one of the first people, involved in that too. Tony Jones, as well, a number of others. Dan Kimball, as well. And I think what they noticed is their diagnosis was that these mindsets and techniques and ideas were just too modern. Is kind of how they pinpointed it. That instead we are in postmodern times. And so things had to shift. There was a disconnect, from the youth they were working with. But McLaren saw beyond that too, not just youth, but other people he was ministering to. And, I think, in their seeing those kinds of effects, I forget the guy's name who brought to bear. It wasn't Chris C.A., but I'm forgetting his name. But he brought to light a lot of the philosophical kinds of influences too. But over time, I think we've seen, with McLaren, one of the things he fed back to me after my first book on this was that he wasn't so concerned about postmodern epistemology as he was about ethics. And how it seems like so many well-meaning Christians from this so-called modern age or influenced by a modern thought could seem to get things so wrong and take some very unethical stances, he thought. And so, I saw them publish a lot, with Zondervan at the time and Baker Books, too. So with evangelical type publishing houses. But that's changed. They're now with some of the biggest presses, Harper One, for example, Random House. But one of the things that happened, I think, that made a shift of that, at least that I kind of experienced also at the ETS, kind of conferences, it seemed like there were some real strong, maybe even strident Calvinists, who really made some very strong critiques. In fact, I had a guy once at one of my presentations giving an update on McLaren's thought, and he stood up in the audience and basically said, after I finished my talk, he said, can't we just, kind of cut to the chase and just call them all heretics?
Right.
And let's move on, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think that was kind of evidence of that mindset. It's like, hey, we've done this, we've decided this, let's move on.
Yeah. I experience that even in my work when I write about progressive Christianity, or if I'll review a Rob Bell book or something like that. Inevitably, there'll be somebody that will comment on Facebook or somewhere, hey, why are you even bother with this? Like, we know that these people, but I think what they don't understand is that for the average Christian, it's more difficult to see and to discern when so much of it sounds good, and it can be a little more difficult. So, like, the idea that nobody's listening to Rob Bell anymore just isn't true. A lot of people are. A lot of Christians are.
If they weren't, I don't think these guys would be getting signed on with Harper One and some of these other houses.
Right.
Because I don't think they'd take them on if they didn't feel there was a market, for them.
Yeah, for sure.
I think their influence has morphed and has just changed its shape. And I think that a lot of evangelicals, they're just not these guys aren't on their radar screens anymore because of those kinds of critiques.
I think that's true. And I've noticed in the progressive world that there's kind of this animosity toward Calvinists. There's definitely some bad blood there. So on the flip side of that coin, you have modern evangelicalism, which, a lot of people are saying, I don't even know what that word means anymore because it's just taken on so many different shapes. But let's talk about the history of that and what factors helped shape the church in the West.
Quite a few, and I'm sure I'm going to miss some, but I'll point to a few. I'll mention a great resource that I used a lot was George Marsden's Fundamentalism in American Culture. It's not the only source I would recommend, but I think it's a very important one, and he highlights a lot of these very things. One of them was how shaped evangelicals in this country or the U.S. Were shaped by the influences of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. There was a lot of really good things. Holding on to, I think, orthodox beliefs. I think that was a great heritage. That our forebears did. But there were things that when we start, and Marsden helps surface some of this, but if you look, in some other ways, you can see other factors too. And one was how deeply wedded they were to the idea of science as it came through the revolution. I'm trying to remember who it is who says this, but Marsden cites several people from our evangelical heritage who basically, thought that to do theology properly, you've got to do it as a science. Well, the science of the times, that they inherited was one that focused on empirical means and also had this idea of a mechanical atomism. So basically, creation and we are mechanisms, and we're fundamentally made up of atoms. So how do you factor in a soul with that was, an interesting question. So there's a tension, at least in the views, even if I didn't see him deny that we had souls, but there's a tension there. Mm-hmm. And you start playing out this kind of idea. If the universe is really made that way, it lends itself to a more deistic, kind of view of God. So even kind of unconsciously, ideas have consequences, I think. And one of the unconscious ones could be over time is that functionally, at least, God was kind of distant from us, and not so intimate and personal, with us. Mm-hmm. So I think that's part of it, and I think that by emphasizing, science as the yardstick for all knowledge, it tends to marginalize, even in Christians' minds, it could start marginalizing the reality of things like souls, angels, God, or any other immaterial sorts of things. And so one of the things Marsden points out really well is that there was such a strong confidence in the truth of Christianity, which is good, I think, but at the same time, they had an overconfidence, I think, in our reason's abilities, called common sense. It was just a matter of common sense to them that what the Bible said was true. Well, I think that's fine, but when it got challenged, then they didn't have a real response ready for that. Yeah. And they kind of let science develop on its own without trying to think, how should this integrate with Christianity? So when Darwinism finally came along as the big break, they had nothing to say to that except that it was, that's just not, good science. They had no answers, but it was like the rug got pulled out from under them and got put on the defensive, very much. So those are a few factors.
And that points us really to one of the main points of your book, which is that Christians have been deeply influenced by naturalism, which I found really interesting because I had never really thought of it in that way before I read your book. And in a moment, we're going to get into some of the disagreements that you have with the theology of people like Brian McLaren and Tony Jones. But before we get to that, I just wanted to mention again, I kind of alluded to this before, but I love this about your book is that you are as charitable as possible while still maintaining truth. And so you mentioned some contributions that progressive thought leaders have given that are helpful or even maybe positive. So before we get into the negative stuff, let's talk a little bit about those positive contributions. What would you say they are?
Well, first of all, I appreciate your saying, that you could see that I was trying to be, charitable, and not just okay, let's critique it here.
Yeah, let's pull out the fire hose and blast them all away.
Because I really tried to do that in all my writings, and I really wanted to do that here. And plus, one of the things I found myself thinking many times that in writing this book, that they were right about a whole lot more than I realized when I wrote the first one. Now that doesn't mean I've embraced all their theology or anything like that, but nonetheless, some of their observations were more astute, I think, than I realized. And some of these are more subtle, but I think that one of the things that they pick up about, at least a tendency among some evangelicals, I'm not sure how. I wouldn't want to say all by any means.
Sure.
But a tendency to be too controlling, in various ways. In fact, I think one of the things the Lord's tried to make me sensitive to is how well-meaning evangelicals who want to hold on to the truth. I mean, I want to hold on to truth, but at the same time, can actually beat people, with truth. Yeah. And not model, how Jesus balanced and wed together in himself. He embodied grace and truth, like it says in John 1. And I think that, if we use truth that way, we can use it as a weapon. And that drives people's hearts away, from the Lord. I think they're sensitive to that, these guys. And I think that they also, what's the word? Maybe it's partly because they've, grown through and lived in postmodern times, but they've got baloney detectors. Was a better word. They are quick to detect arrogance, and I don't think I was attuned to that until I paid attention to what they were saying. Tony one time gave me a response in my first book. He said, pastors, he found might speak as though they've got invincible truth. with this proud confidence. And I took that in the epistemic, sort of way. That, oh, yeah, we can have this utter certainty. And, yeah, it fits with that. But there's more than just the theory of knowledge. There can be an attitude of arrogance with it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think that ties with a sense of being naturalized, because I think that's a fruit of relying on our own selves rather than the Spirit of God, depending on Him to do the conviction. I think I want to be careful in saying this here too, because yes, I think the gospel is surely, about our salvation from our sins, being with the Lord, after we die, for sure. But when they stress, when some of these guys stress how the gospel can be, transformed into people's minds such that it's like, this is what it's all about, going to heaven when we die.
Get out of hell free card.
Right. And I think they're right, and that emphasis is misguided. I mean, I want as many people to be in heaven as possible, for sure, to know the Lord now and, then. But I think that they were right, in the sense of, like Dallas Willard talks about, it ends up being a gospel of sin management now, rather than really living in the fullness of life Jesus offers us now. And my goodness, I think that's the thing that will really draw people. And we can see the Spirit poured out on the church, too. So I think they've hit that really well. And I think just another quick one. I think that they are right in that because of that kind of emphasis, too many evangelicals have not really focused on ethical concerns, in broader society. I mean, they're right, to point out environmental concerns and social justice concerns. One of my colleagues at Talbot just put out an article. He says, got to keep them in order. Gospel's first priority, but don't forget that we are commanded to do social justice. And I think that's well taken. But we could lose that second if we think it's all about going to heaven when we die.
Right. And it also, I think it's important the way we define social justice, because often, and I know that when we're talking, we mean biblical justice and that kind of thing. But it's so interesting the point you make about the get out of hell free card type salvation, because I think that the evangelical culture, and this is actually something that I've been thinking a lot about, and as I write my book, I'm trying to give a little bit of attention to this. Even growing up in the evangelical church in the late 80s and 90s, there seemed to be a lot of focus on heaven and hell. There was the traveling drama Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames, where people would flood the altars because they were just terrified that the devil would drag them off to hell, and it really wasn't about putting their trust in Jesus so much. And I'm not blaming that play. I'm sure there are people who gave their hearts to Christ at that play and are walking with him now. It's not just but it just seemed, even in second grade, I was remembering my teacher taught about hell all the time in our little Christian school. And so there was so much fear involved in salvation. And there, I mean, of course we fear God and there's an appropriate fear, but there did seem to get lost in the greater evangelical culture a focus on a holistic salvation. And that was actually one of the things that drew me to what would end up becoming a progressive church. I didn't know that at the time, but they had some of the same critiques that I did, some of the same, like you said, baloney meter stuff. And that's what drew me to the church that I've told my story about, where my faith was challenged, because I didn't dream that they were willing to throw the real gospel away along with, some of the errors, which I'm so thankful that the Lord was so with me to walk me through that. But I get what you're saying, because some of those critiques that they brought in the beginning were legitimate. These were things that we needed to look at as a church. But for me, I think it always just came down to the gospel. And so I want to kind of drill down on that a little bit. And one of the, I think, a really clear explanation of what a lot of progressives believe about the gospel can be found in Brian McLaren's A New Kind of Christianity. And he calls kind of the typical evangelical, or at least his understanding of that gospel, the Greco-Roman 6-line narrative. So I'd
Right.
love it if you could unpack that for us. What is Brian McLaren's Greco-Roman 6-line narrative? What does he mean by that?
Okay. Well, he's taken a step further than those who have read just his earlier books might realize. There, he seems to contrast modernity and postmodernity. Now he's digging back deeper and saying, okay, the root problems were further back than I think he realized earlier. And he's thinking that our contemporary understanding, this is his trying to say as he might say it, our contemporary understanding of the gospel as evangelicals has been deeply shaped by Greek philosophy, especially with its emphasis on dualisms. I'll give a few examples. And then the Roman outlook of being imperialistic. And arrogant, with that. So he looks at it and says this first line or first step with it, he looks at God's creation as originally made, and he describes it as being, on this view, perfect, without any change. It's static. It's good, but to be good, it's got to be this perfect, static, unchanging thing. And he explains that as being like Plato's ideas or a Neoplatonic idea, that these forms, Plato had these ideas about universal qualities like goodness and truth and beauty are unchanging, things. But he then explains the fall, into sin, as a shift into Aristotelian becoming, he says. Mm-hmm. And on Aristotle's view, or on his understanding of Aristotle's view, that means this is a profane, material, kind of world. I guess contrasted with the Neoplatonic, you've got this perfect, unchanging kind of realm, and then you've got, that's the kind of upper story, you might call it, and then there's a lower story, and it's the profane, kind of the material, kind of realm. And the fall, he thinks, is represented by, in terms of a fall into becoming or change from something perfect into what changes and becomes a subject that stories can be told of. So it's bad, that we had this change, or being able to tell stories about things marks a condition that's bad. And his idea of God, whom he dubs Theos, is this perfect Platonic, kind of God who loves perfection and hates anything that changes, anything that's less than perfect, and wants to destroy it. Just blows up in rage, at this kind of stuff. So he says the third step, Theos, or God, this view is full of condemnation, of his creation, that is slipped from perfection. And the fourth step involves, salvation, being, just with God. And then the fifth or sixth steps, there are two results that can happen. One is we end up, being elevated back to this plane of perfection, which is, heaven, or we are sent, to an unchanging state of torment, of hell. Both those, two ends are static, unchanging, for him. And one of the things with the dualism, kind of idea with that, one of the things he sees as far as a Roman mindset, he thinks he sees in the church can be an imperialistic mindset of trying to convert people, to Christianity as the only way to God. He's become a pluralist, in his more recent writings. Mm-hmm. Like, why did Jesus, Moses, the Buddha, et cetera, cross the road? I think explains it pretty clearly. And he sees that exclusiveness and arrogance, in Christians, especially evangelicals. And he thinks that also marked the Roman kind of mindset. Mm-hmm. And the Greek mindset, he sees we've had this in, just even Plato's kind of structure of two realms. There's a dualism, involved, there. And also a dualism of we are body and soul, and a dualism between creation and God, heaven and hell. And this dualistic kind of thinking, he thinks, has been imported from the Greek mindset. And that it wasn't actually something, that came from the Hebrew, outlook in the Old Testament, which he thinks is much more holistic.
Yeah. So if we were to just summarize that, he's basically saying our whole idea, and tell me if I'm getting this right, because this is as much from my understanding as everybody else. He's basically saying the whole idea that man sinned and that separated us from God, and then God is, that God has wrath for sin, and that we need to be saved from it to go to some eternal destiny of heaven and hell, is really just an adopted view from Greek philosophers about dualism, about having a body and a soul that are these kind of two, one is good and one is evil. Is that sort of in the ballpark there?
Yeah, and one of the key things, and this may be jumping ahead a little bit, but I think that one of the, for me, I work as a philosopher and ethicist, and one of the things I keep looking for in people's views, because partly the way I've been trained, I think, to think, but is when you make shifts in the underlying nature of things, the ontology, if you will, the nature of what's real, it's bound to have ripple effects in other ways. And that's one of the things that's happened here. In response to or in reaction against this perceived dualism, and I think the traditional Orthodox Christian view we've inherited, the best reading of Scripture is a dualistic kind of one, that we are a union of body and soul, right, and things like that, and God is not identified with his creation or something like that. Mm-hmm. There is a difference between heaven and hell. For them, there's a shift to seeing all creation as being one kind of thing, and it's all physical. And that one of the things that that comes out very clearly, I think, from Tony Jones. He studied with Nancy Murphy, and learned her physicalism, there. Mm-hmm. Reading Rob Bell's more recent things too. About everything's about matter and energy. Right. Yeah. Even saying God is energy. Paget's ideas in his book called Flipped. And then when I read a book by Scott Burson called Brian McLaren in Focus. Have you seen that book?
I've seen it, and I need to read that one. I haven't read it myself.
I'd highly recommend it. I talked with him, and that was based on his dissertation, and it didn't make the cut into the final book, but in his dissertation, he goes into McLaren's views about the nature of what's real. And it's very much from Murphy, that kind of creation is physical. Mm-hmm. And when you make those kinds of changes, several other things have to change. The nature of what's our core problem, what's the solution, explaining our relationship to God, all that sort of stuff.
We'll come right back to our discussion with Dr. R. Scott Smith in just a moment, but I want to tell you about a ministry that I partner with called Impact 360. They facilitate summer experiences for high schoolers, and one of those experiences is called Propel. This is where students spend a week in an active learning environment. They grow through engaging sessions, one-on-one discipleship, and experiential leadership training. Students are equipped in knowing who they are in Christ, and they're also given tools to influence their peers. You can sign up your student by going to impact360.org/propel. You can use my name as a promo code. That's Alisa, all caps, ALISA, for $25 off your tuition. I will be there. I would love to meet your high schooler at Propel this summer, where they'll be challenged to live out their faith with confidence. So with now that you've kind of explained what McLaren's Greco-Roman six-line narrative is, what do you think he gets wrong about it? What do you think are the main points where maybe he's taken a misstep and has led him down this path? Where do you disagree with him?
Well, one of them is that very thing. When McLaren makes a move to say that really we are not a union of body and soul, we are bodies. And I should qualify that because in his generous orthodoxy, he talks about how the soul might emerge, from certain capacities, that once the brain is in a certain degree of complexity, these things might emerge and whatnot. But that is something that is an emergent byproduct, of physical things. Creation seems to be physical for him. And so when you start down that road, and that's one of the things that came out in that discussion with that former student of mine in that class I taught back in 2006, it started to come out that, he and others, have made this move toward, you could call it an anthropological monism. What kind of thing we are is one kind of stuff. We're physical. Well, then you start thinking about, what's the nature of sin? How do you account for sin on that kind of view if we are physical? Because to me, it sure seems like it's a matter of, my will. If I'm, committing, something, I'm choosing this.
Yeah.
Maybe I've omitted something too, but sin seems to be an attitude, from the heart that I act on. But if you're just physical things, how do you account for that kind of stuff? These kind of notions. And so sin has to change. And the way I've seen it described is a disruption of relationships. I think Paget describes it that way. So sin has disrupted relationships, but it's not like we somehow don't stand in relation to God already. Because if we are physical things, and the way Paget and Jones even goes here, and I think Bell too, and I think arguably McLaren, we are already in God. They've gone away from a theistic understanding to a panentheistic understanding.
Yes, and that's in the progressive church. There are the thing that surprised me as I studied more was how many progressive Christians are very open about identifying themselves as panentheists. It's something that they openly embrace and say, this is the nature of God. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
So if we're already in relation to God in some way, shape, or form here, and there's some metaphysical reasons that I tried to talk about in the book, that explain that a little bit more too, of why they might think that. But if we're already in a relation to God, we're standing this. Yes, we're somehow in God. It's not like then we need to establish a relationship with God.
Right.
So I would say it's by, trusting Christ's atoning work on the cross for my payment for my sin, and then the Spirit, comes into my life. I'm born again, and all those good things. You don't need that.
Right.
Instead, you already in that relationship. So start working on your relationships.
Yeah.
In other words, act ethically.
Yeah.
So start treating, one another, and in the ethical ways, and that emphasis on the praxis is great. I mean, that's a good emphasis, but it's predicated here on the assumption that we are already in relationship to God, and it's all based, I think, on this shift in terms of what's real. So that has effects then in terms of the nature of what God's solution for our sin. There's no need for Christ to die on the cross as a penal substitutionary atoning sacrifice. There's just need. And besides issues of God being violent, that McLaren, for example, just recoils at.
Yeah.
So those are a few of the problems. McLaren, I think, also overlooks, some other options to the issues he sees from Calvinism that he reacts against, like this, strong predestination. He thinks that it's immoral, for God to simply predestine us to heaven or hell. But he doesn't really engage with the Arminian, type answers.
Right.
Or a middle knowledge one. And I think he badly misunderstands Aristotle, just to look at this a little bit more as a philosopher. It wasn't bad that we change on Aristotle's view. Not at all. And frankly, I think even biblically, before the fall, things were changing too. Just in terms of the depth that Adam and Eve grew in their knowing each other and knowing God. Yeah. It's not like this was ever to be understood to be some static, unchanging thing.
Well, that makes sense, because when I've read about the state of the Garden of Eden, the Bible says that it was good, but it doesn't actually say that it was perfect, because there was room to grow. It had potential to change and become better. It was pure and it was ordered and filled, but it wasn't fully yet what it was intended to be. So therefore, maybe perfect isn't the right word to use there. Well, this is really good. This is all really helpful, because I think there's some confusion among some people when they hear the phrase progressive Christianity. I think some people might think, oh, is that progressive in a more political sense? Or are progressive Christians just a group of Christians who are evolving on social issues, but underneath that, we all kind of believe the same thing? Right. And the deeper I get into this, the more I research, the more I realize that the progressive gospel is really, it's not just political, it's not just a social issue thing. It's actually a completely different gospel.
Right.
And so I want to focus in on McLaren just as an example. He rejects that Greco-Roman 6-line narrative, and you kind of hinted at this before, but he trades that in favor of what he understands as a more Jewish understanding of the gospel. So if you'll unpack that for us a little bit, if somebody asked Brian McLaren, what is the gospel? What is McLaren going to answer? What is McLaren's gospel?
Well, I think the main things that have come to my mind on that is that the good news is that we are already in relationship with God, now. And so we need to, put our focus on praxis. Let's live in light of that. And he thinks, the story we should embrace to do that is Jesus' story, as I think he, has understood it, and maybe other progressives too. I think that, as far as the good news is, again, that, while sin has damaged or disrupted, maybe our relationship with God, it's not severed us. We're not dead to God. And so,
how does he relate that with Jewish thought? Like, how does he, because he's basically asserting in the book that this is how Jews understood it. So maybe you can just unpack that a little bit.
Well, I think that that's challenging, to do, and I think that McLaren and I think others too seem to embrace this idea that there's this holism, in the Hebraic, scriptures. Tony Jones one time made a comment to me. Trying to remember how he put it. We were having dinner, and how did he say it? I think it was something like this. Nancy Murphy's non-reductive physicalism was the best explanation that he saw for the unity of persons emphasized in the Old Testament. I thought, fascinating. And I think that maybe another way to kind of play off that to help see why would you think that there's this unity of persons because we're this completely physical thing, this unity of all physical stuff. Well, if you look at a book by Joel Green, I think it's called Body, Soul, and Life Everlasting. It's an interesting book. He's mainly an exegete, but he's also adopted this turned physicalism, by Murphy, I think. And when he goes in there, he's basically critiquing the Cartesian view of dualism, substance dualism, that the body is like a mechanism and the soul is this radically different thing, and there's such different things. How do they possibly interact? So you have this, it's a disjunction almost. So instead, it sounds so attractive to say, oh my goodness, well, here's how we can be this integrated whole being. Now, one thing Green does, though, in that book, he just kind of mentions in passing an alternative and says, well, there's a holistic kind of dualism that someone like one of my mentors, J.P. Moreland, argues for. But then he just doesn't pick it up and deal with it anymore. And the main target is the Cartesian view. And the alternative is, well, physicalism, satisfies this holism. Again, how McLaren, I think, interprets, the Old Testament, it seems like it's, this. There's some parts where McLaren discusses Genesis, Exodus, and then one of the prophets, and I think it's Isaiah. And in that, he talks about how sin, can be treated like a coming of age story, like a father to his child. God doesn't disown us because we're in his family. And I wouldn't do that to my daughter, for example, kind of thing. But to set it up as though that there's not this need to punish sin, it seems like, is how he interprets it. And he one of the things that's really strong for him, and he said this very directly to me one time, that God just cannot be violent, to him. He said something like, if God, were to be violent, then the whole thing, and I think even Christianity would just fall to the ground for him. So there's something going on here that I don't know what it is, but there's more than just a interpretive, intellectual framework, I think. But somehow this is really important for him. And he thinks, that, he wants to hold on to a God who is just and good, and yet that colors his interpretations here, thinking that God can't, punish sin. He can't. It's almost as though, we lose God's holiness, I think, in this.
And there seems to be this chasm between progressive Christians and historic Christians in the way that we think about God and the way that we evaluate the actions of God throughout history. A common theme I come across in the progressive church and in books and blogs and things like that is this idea that I couldn't believe in a God who, and then fill in the blank. And so it's a way of relating God and evaluating his actions based on how I would behave and how I would act. And what would I do if I was a father, or if I was a king or a judge or a ruler, and then if God doesn't meet that standard, then somehow he's subpar, or that couldn't really be him. And of course, this contradicts the historic view of God, in that God is other than us. We are not like him. He is not like us. And when I ask myself that question, I probably wouldn't send anyone to hell, but that's because I have limited knowledge of justice. I have limited knowledge of love, even. As hard as it is to grasp, I trust that God is both fully good and fully just. And there just seems to be a chasm there between the two different groups and how we see God. And recently there was a debate between Paul Copan and Greg Boyd, and it had to do with Boyd's hermeneutic, which he calls the cruciform hermeneutic, which is very similar to what Brian McLaren talks about in A New Kind of Christianity, where they view Scripture as fossils in layers of sediment. That Boyd's, as far as I understand it, now I haven't read his his 2-volume work on it. But as far as I understand it, it's basically evaluating the actions of God throughout the Old Testament, but filtering it through the attitude of Jesus on the cross of, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And if it doesn't fit through that filter, then it probably wasn't God, or something along those lines. Wow. But something that was so interesting about that debate is that Paul Copan pointed out that Boyd, in his 2-volume work, didn't even define the word violence. And so when he's accusing God of violence or saying God doesn't act violently, his idea of violence was without definition, because of course there's different kinds of violence.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering if, maybe you've encountered something like this in your research.
I just came out of a panel discussion between 2 faculty members about immigration. And this was one of the plots, in it. You can see, violence in the sense of excluding, not having open borders. And it got me thinking, it's like, well, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Is any kind of coercion, violent then? If I have some sort of penalty, for my daughter, let me pick a personal example, just for myself, let's say, or not, she hasn't done this yet, but to say, hey, I come home way after curfew that my parents set for me, and guess what? I lost my privileges, for using the car, for the next week. Okay, was that violent?
Right, because it's going to cause her some discomfort and even possibly some suffering.
And one of the things that was running through my mind after this lunch, but also when you just said this, and it reminded me of something I wrote in the book too, I just can't help but think, but the kind of God we end up with on this view is a codependent God.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up, because as you were talking, I knew that I had highlighted that, and I was looking on my Kindle to try to bring it up, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is such a perfect word to describe really the end game of this type of thinking. You end up with a God that's codependent with you.
And those are not moral heroes.
Right.
I've had to deal with enough of that in my own life, marriage, and family upbringing, and it's like, you want to grow out of that.
Yes.
And there are no boundaries, on this.
Yeah.
And it's just ugly stuff, I think. And you end up with a God who's not really worthy of worship, I think.
Yeah, that's well put. Well, as we close out here, what advice would you give to Christians who are just bombarded with all kinds of different ideas all the time, and they're trying to be discerning during these times, but it can just be discouraging and confusing? What advice would you give about discernment?
Well, a few general ideas. One is try to research things, carefully. I would actually read their own works, not just what others have said about them. Hopefully my book, could be of help. I think Scott Burson's book called Brian McLaren in Focus is really worthwhile. I was really glad to see, that come out. Mm-hmm. I think another would be to realize that these, emergents, or formerly known as emergent folks, they're really onto some key things, that are awry, with all too many evangelical churches. But I think at the same time, I think they've misidentified, a lot of the key problems here. Mm-hmm. And I think, like you mentioned earlier, I think that this is actually due to a common problem that they share with evangelicals. They've both been deeply shaped by naturalistic kind of thinking, in a sense that God becomes largely irrelevant. And that is just not, what I see, in Scripture at all. God wants to be intimate with us, wants us to wholly depend upon Him, listen to His voice, know His presence and power and all its fullness. That is the kind of thing Christianity is supposed to really be like. Yeah. And unfortunately, I don't think either of these are really all too many are not really living this out. So I'm afraid that evangelicals, can distance God, but I'm afraid that that's what happens on this kind of theology as well. In fact, God, I don't even know how we could have a personal relationship with God on this view. If we're just physical things, let alone, I don't know what that makes God.
Yeah.
Since God is called energy himself.
Right.
Sounds like God may not be personal either.
Yeah.
So anyway, I guess the bottom line, encouragement I would try to do is what I said in the very end of the book, is try to really seek the fullness of truth as well as the fullness of the Spirit, because I think that's what the Lord really wants us to live in. And that's what I think I want both groups I've looked at in this book to really embrace.
Well, that is great advice, and your book exemplifies that. And so it's called Authentically Emergent: In Search of a Truly Progressive Christianity. Scott, thanks so much for your time and for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Well, thanks for having me very, very much.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, you can sign up to receive my posts by email by going to alisachilders.com and clicking the subscribe button, or simply subscribe to the Alisa Childers podcast on iTunes.